jump into this. So we're going to look at Ezekiel chapter 1 to 3, and we should finish this lesson, which is the life and calling of Ezekiel. And then the lesson for next week, we might get into it. I already have it here. It's entitled, let me get my own copy here, The Watchman, chapters 4, 5, 6, and 7. And so just to start off today, I'm going to kind of recap what we've been doing. I've spent an inexcusable amount of time setting this class up because you have the whole history of Israel and then Ezekiel being born and growing up inside southern Judah during these early, ostensibly 30 years of his early life, and then being taken into exile just the years before 593. And so there's a whole context here. And when I was first reading the Bible, getting into the books of the prophets was one of the hardest things because there's so much history that is there before you even read the first verse. And if you don't know anything about it, it's very, very difficult to get into the book. And so I've spent a long time just sort of setting that stage. So to kind of recap, the power in the world is Babylon. The Babylonian Empire doesn't last very long. It lasts about a half a century. But it's the greatest, most magnificent empire that the world has ever seen. And it will be replaced by the Persians, and they in turn will be replaced by the Romans. That's what I'm talking about with the students in school where I teach. We just got through the Battle of Marathon and the Thermopylae and all of that cool stuff, and Alexander the Great into the Greek Empire. But right now, Babylon is top dog. Babylon is top dog. Nebuchadnezzar is now the emperor of Babylon, and he rules a significant empire. Nebuchadnezzar's wife is a Median princess. So they are in an alliance with the Medes to the east. He's going to, as a gift, build her as a gift to his princess when he finishes his ziggurat, which is almost 700 feet tall. That's almost as tall as the St. Louis Arch. That is a very big mud brick ziggurat. He's going to create a system of aqueducts to bring water up to the top using, many people think Archimedes invented the screw. It carries water up the top, but it's earlier than Archimedes. And by using that, allow the water to flow down from the top down so he can basically create hanging gardens all the way down from his ziggurat. And that will be one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Everybody looked at that and thought, well, how did he pull that off? So it's not there anymore. Nebuchadnezzar is the man. His father, Nabopolassar, built this empire, but he comes into possession of it. He's in alliance with Medes and Persians and Elamites, Scythians in the north. He's going to press his advantage into Asia Minor. He already has the Arameans in Phoenicia in northern Israel, and now he's pushing down into Judah. And Judah's going to fall. And when he's done with Judah, the crown jewel of the ancient world is, of course, Egypt. If you conquer Egypt, you can do anything. And he won't quite conquer Egypt, but he'll leave a big footprint. And so that's what he wants to do. Ezekiel is among the earliest exiles to be taken from Judah into Babylon. They're near the city of Nippur, which is a well-known city, the Kebar Canal. And the climate among the exiles, as we've discussed, is they think this is going to blow over. Jerusalem will not be taken. The temple will not crumble. And God's going to rescue them at the last minute We got numerous prophets saying this to the people, so everybody's all excited. And I think this sometimes happens in the Christian world too. You get pastors and teachers who are telling people what they want to hear. And so those are going to be the popular ones. And Ezekiel here is going to be put in the unenviable position of having to tell people no. And we saw last week Ezekiel was heavily influenced by Jeremiah. Jeremiah was not a popular prophet. He did not have a message that anybody wanted to hear. And he was very alone. Ezekiel will be the same way. Now, today, on page 17, I'm going to kind of go over the first vision and then the calling. Ezekiel has more visions than any other prophet of the Old Testament. He sees God, or at least a representation of God, in numerous accounts. In addition to these visions that Ezekiel has, they always leave him kind of wiped out. So whenever he has a vision, for several days, he's not able to cope or return to ordinary life. In chapter 17, we probably have what is page 17, chapter 1, beginning in the 4th verse. We probably have what is the most extensive vision of Yahweh in the Old Testament. Hands down. It's taken over by the book of Revelation later. If you've read the book of Revelation, all of this stuff comes right out of Ezekiel. And so we are looking at chapter 1, verse 4 to chapter 1, verse 28. We got started on this last week. And so I'm going to pick up here again. And I have done a lot of the translating in this lesson for myself. Some words from the Hebrew are difficult. I've left those. But while Ezekiel is at the Kebar Canal, which is a canal that we know something of, a wind from the north. So whenever these old texts say a north wind, what they mean is a wind coming from the north. So a west wind would be a wind coming from the west. The old Greek word for that is zephyr, a west wind or a zephyr. And you hear about the four winds in classical literature and stuff. But a north wind brings a radiant cloud toward him. So a storm cloud that is blinking and glowing from within. And we're reminded of the Exodus story. This is what led the Israelites out of Exodus. And so it says, I looked, a stormy wind came from the north, a great cloud, a mass of fire surrounded by radiance. In the midst of the fire, something that looked like, boom, we have this untranslatable word. And there's several of these in Ezekiel. They're called apex legomena. They're either words that occur only once or very, very few times, and we're not quite sure what they mean. So I talked about that one last week. I won't go back into it. Hashmal is some sort of glowing. A lot of translations say like molten metal. But it's there in the center of the cloud. And it's what Ezekiel sees of Yahweh. Now, Ezekiel is very careful to say, I saw the likeness of this, I saw the likeness of that, I saw the likeness of that over there. Because we know that no one may behold Yahweh and live. That is an old Hebrew bit of orthodoxy. And so these are all likenesses. Incidentally, too, it's clear that what he sees is a chariot. The Hebrew word there is Merkabah. But we got the four living creatures, each which are beside the wheels, and are carrying Yahweh on a kind of dais or a platform where a throne sits. Then he sits on top of it. And so Yahweh is coming from the north. Now, presumably then, if Yahweh is coming from the north, he's coming down to Babylon along this ark and meets with Ezekiel there. It's got to be a vision. I mean, chariots are time-bound things. It's not like in heaven, if Yahweh appeared to a person today, would he appear in a chariot or a tank? Some kind of device for modern warfare. But a chariot, there was a time before chariots had been invented. There's a time after chariots have ceased to be. So we have a vision here appropriate to the time and the place where it occurs. That's very, very important. The four living creatures carrying the chariot are called, later in the text, cherubim. And cherubim are well known from the ancient world. Even outside Israel, we think of them as a sphinx, some kind of a composite animal. The body of a lion, the head of a human, the wings of an eagle, though in Ezekiel's vision, there are a few features here that we don't find in other ancient Near Eastern texts. Each of these cherubim have four faces: a human, a bull, a lion, an eagle. And I think I said last week, these are the noblest of the creatures. The lion is the king of the wild animals. The bull is the most powerful of the domestic animals. Of the things that fly, the eagle. And of course, of all created beings, the master over all is man. Man is master. Sometimes laugh, you get people who say, well, what's so special about human beings? The only reason we think that we're special is because of some sort of speciest bias. I mean, look at the planet. I mean, who's dominating the planet? I mean, whether we think that's good or bad, human beings are clearly dominating the planet. We are the masters of the planet. So man is, it's not just purely out of speciesism that we think that we're special. We are, in fact. Now, interesting though, in Ezekiel's vision, all four are carrying the chariot. So Yahweh is sovereign over all. So they are all servants. And of course, the four living creatures are going to reappear in the book of Revelation in paintings like the ones my mom's looking at these days in Paris. They'll be depicted as the four evangelists: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So I don't think Ezekiel has anything like that in mind, but it's a handy number. And you can sort of see the idea that if Jesus and Yahweh are one, what are the four that are carrying his chariot but the four evangelists? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so the writers of the Middle Ages kind of found something significant in that. By the feet of the four living creatures, page 18, of course, are wheels. And the wheels are, in their rims, inlaid with eyes. I will do this, you can see in my notes here, I put in parentheses, signifying the divine watchfulness, ? So as I go through the text, sometimes I indicate what I think a particular part of the vision might mean. This is an old motif in ancient Near Eastern literature generally, is that eyes signify watchfulness, awareness, knowledge. You got to remember that at this point in history, they don't have sort of Greek philosophy hasn't been invented. So nobody has ideas of omniscience, all-knowingness. They're going to express such ideas through pictures or images. So nobody as far back as Ezekiel's day is going to say God is all-knowing. But if they want to express a similar idea, they may say that there's a lot of eyes. Yeah.
So do you think Ezekiel saw a big wheel with eyes on it, or he was trying to express a concept that he otherwise couldn't express?
Well, that's just it. He saw something that had the appearance of wheels with many eyes.
And do you think it was necessarily there for him to understand? Maybe there's those eyes out there, and God didn't expect him necessarily to understand it? Or was it there for him to interpret and understand?
I tend, and this is a disputable point, to think that between what Ezekiel saw and how he understood it, there's a back and forth that finally comes to us in the text. Ezekiel is clearly interpreting what he's seeing on the basis of what a highly educated Jew in the 6th century would understand what he saw. But it's clear that he uses the imagery of his day, chariot, the wheels, the eyes. And so I don't think that what we're reading here is just straight historical reporting. It's a combination of something that he saw, but there's also a lot of interpretation that he's bringing to it from his own perspective. And that's the safe approach that I take with it. Because anytime you have a theophany is a word that means a vision or an experience of God, it's going to be seen through the lens of the person who sees it. Just as I look around this room, there's many things to see, but I see them through the lens of me. And so between what is out there to see and between me, the seer, there's a sort of conversation that goes on. And I see that definitely happening in Ezekiel. So I'm somewhere in the middle ground between saying everything that's described here is exactly as he describes it, which he's actually very careful to avoid, and saying that it's all just subjective. There's some kind of a conversation going on here where Ezekiel is seeing things and he's translating them into language that would be meaningful to a 6th century audience. Is probably the right way to think of it. And that's true when we get to the Gospels, too, in the New Testament. We have to be very mindful that the writers are translating the things that Jesus said, the things that Jesus did, into a language that they think would be meaningful to the people of the day. And we do that even now. Even pastors do that now. When pastors in the 20th century begin talking about having a personal relationship with Jesus, this is not language we find in the Bible. But it is language that is meaningful for people in a particular time and a place, and it enables them to take things and make them relevant for people in their own time and place. Above the wings of the 4 living creatures, Ezekiel sees a dais. A dais is sort of a platform on which you would set a throne. And this is called the Rakiah. I mentioned this last week, like dreadful ice spread out over their heads. The Rakiah is the dome of the heavens. It's a widely used idea in the ancient world. If you walk out these doors and look up at the sky, you see what appears to be a clear dome. It looks like we're all in the Silver Dome or something. Anybody even know what the Silver Dome is anymore? Yeah, we don't know what the Silver Dome is. You know, and I feel sad. I remember when they built the palace. They stopped doing the Silver Dome. They built the palace. There's no palace there anymore. It's all just a big hill, all gone. And we went to several basketball games. Joe Lilly knew some people there, and we went to several basketball games at the Palace of Auburn Hills, and it's all gone. Easy come, easy go. All happened, in the first half of my lifetime. So the Rakiah is what God creates on day 2 of Genesis 1. So in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Day 1, light. Day 2, This is a tough word to translate. The old NIV that I grew up with said, "Let there be an expanse over the heavens." The old King James Version called it a firmament. Let there be a firmament. A firmament is like a solid half bowl. But the problem is there's really no English equivalent for this idea. In the text, in the verse immediately following is to separate the waters above from the waters below. So you get the idea of there's all this water, and then Yahweh creates this dome, and then there's water up here, and then there's space down here, and there's water below. And then, of course, the dry ground's going to appear, but you're basically dealing with ancient cosmology. The Babylonians have this idea, the Assyrians have this idea, the Persians have this idea. Even Aristotle tweaks it a bit in his physics. But we have the idea of a clear glass. Glass isn't the right word. A clear dome made of some mysterious substance. Aristotle invents a word for it. He calls it the ether. It's made out of ether. And ether has had an interesting history in Western civilization. Now we have Ethernet and ether this and ether that. So for me, the ether is like my Uncle Jerry Peden. Every time I met him, he had a different job. And there are words in the language like that. Ether, one age means this, and one age means that. But they're holding it up, and then on top of page 19, I'm going to clear out the vision and then go to the calling, because that's what I want to spend the latter half of today's class dealing with. And that'll get us through this lesson. But I want to stop once I get through the vision and see if there's any questions about it. The calling will be chapter 2, verse 1 to chapter 3, verse 15. Our text says, in my rendering of it, when the creatures went, the living creatures went, I heard the sound of their wings like the sound of many waters. That phrase reappears in Revelation. This is interesting, like the sound of Shaddai. We do not know what that word means. It is often translated Almighty, like El Shaddai, like the old Michael Card song. El Shaddai, God Almighty. So I footnoted that. Jerome translates it using omnipotence in Latin, and from there it kind of passes into God Almighty. It sounds very like the Semitic word for mountain. So some translations will render it God of the mountain, El Shaddai. A sound of tumult like the sound of an army. There came a voice from above the Rakiah over their heads. Above the Rakiah over their heads was the likeness of a throne with the appearance of sapphire stone. And on the likeness, there's that word again, on the likeness of the throne was the likeness or the appearance of a human, or a likeness with human appearance. From the appearance of his loins upward, I saw the like of the hashmal, that's the glowing. And from the appearance of his loins downward, I saw something like the appearance of fire. And he was surrounded by radiance. You'll recognize all the language used of Christ in the book of Revelation. Like the appearance of the bow that is in a cloud on a rainy day. Such was the appearance of the surrounding radiance. The rainbow is the creational expression of Yahweh in the world. Clouds and light, just like cloud and lightning in the Exodus story. Or just like the flaming pot that flies between the pieces of the sacrifice in the Abraham story in Genesis chapter 15. Abraham falls into a sleep, and there's a cauldron with smoking fire that passes between the pieces. The Hebrews are trying to give expression to Yahweh's presence, and the only way they know how to do it is through cloud and fire. And it reappears in different forms, from Abraham to Moses all the way back to the Noah story. And it reappears again in the book of Revelation. It reappears in the Gospels when it says Christ was taken up It's Ascension Sunday. The Gospel of Luke says when Christ was taken up into heaven, he was hidden by a cloud. A lot of times we interpret that passage in a kind of crass, literal way, like the disciples, oh, there's a cloud, and Jesus sort of hid behind that cloud. But I think if we read it in context with the Old Testament, we have the idea of the cloud signifying the divinity. He's hidden within Yahweh's presence. He returns to the Father, so to speak. The word kavod here, usually translated glory, is the visible manifestation of God's presence, usually a storm cloud, sometimes also personified. Here, the likeness of a human sitting on the throne. And there we have it. So let me stop and see any thoughts or questions about this vision. This vision is going to leave Ezekiel in a stupor for about a week. He'll be just like, and he's done until he kind of comes to. Very, very extensive, powerful, highly detailed vision. Yeah?
My question isn't about the vision, since we weren't here last week. It's a question about something you say on page 50, just a real brief question about, paragraph.
1, 2, 3, 4.
About people of Judah being dispersed to two different countries, Egypt and Babylon.
Yes.
Now, the Egypt, is that when they go down, the group that goes down is Jeremiah, takes Jeremiah down to Egypt? Is that the one?
That's one of them.
Okay.
It starts a little earlier than Jeremiah. Many Jews living in Judah, after the attacks begin coming, begin getting out of town. And they go down into Egypt, and they establish a colony down there. And later, so when later they do take Jeremiah, there's already Jews waiting for him there. We do have some knowledge. Eventually in Egypt, they'll establish a colony on the island of Elephantine, which we have not heard of from the Old Testament, but archaeologists have found that there was a Jewish colony on an island in the Nile. The name of the island is Elephantine. They left writings there. They even built a temple, which they were not supposed to do. At a certain point, we have 3 temples that develop. One in Egypt on Elephantine, one in Mount Gerizim under the Samaritans, and then one in Jerusalem. So we all know the story of the woman who talks to Jesus at the well and says, where shall we worship? Shall we worship at Gerizim? Shall we worship in Jerusalem? She fails to mention that there was even a 3rd temple all the way down in Egypt. The Elephantine papyri, the writings left by the Jews there, are interesting because they show that the Jews living down in Egypt intermingled worship of Yahweh with the local deities of Egypt. Something that Jeremiah certainly would not have been happy with. So anyways, back to that question. Yeah, there definitely were Jews living in Egypt. Egypt became a safe haven for lots of people. There was even a Greek colony down there for Greeks. And so they had several parts of Egypt that were devoted to different peoples throughout the Mediterranean world, some of which were Jews, some of which were Greeks, some of which were native Egyptians. Any other thoughts or questions about this vision? We do know in the century before and after the New Testament, a group of Jews called the Merkabah mystics would try to reproduce Ezekiel's visionary experience. And so mysticism developed in Judaism, the idea that through a certain process of self-denial and mystical contemplation, you could attain a vision of Yahweh. There's some discussion of whether this is what Paul is referring to in one of his letters, where he talks of a certain man he knew who was taken up into the heavens. It seems that Paul's talking about himself in that passage, whether he was involved in these visionary experiences. But this is the earliest development of Jewish mysticism that'll become known as Kabbalah later in the Middle Ages. The Kabbalah, the attempt to attain visionary experiences. And we do find references to them in Paul. Paul, though he is a Pharisaic rabbi, if you read his letters closely, he's one of those religious men who has a finger in just about every pie that exists. There's no stone of religious life that he left unturned in his own pursuit of religious things. And so that begins here. And this passage in Ezekiel was regarded by the early rabbis as one that people shouldn't read too quickly. Dangerous passage, because it involves beholding Yahweh, which in Orthodox Judaism you cannot do. So we come to the calling in chapter 2, verse 1. That'll go to 3:15. Then I heard the voice of one speaking. He said to me, here's an important phrase, Son of man, stand on your feet and I will speak to you. That phrase, Son of man, also has a very interesting history from this time forward. This is also an interesting phrase. The Spirit entered into me when he spoke to me. So, what does that mean? The Spirit entered into me. Now, I put Spirit here in capital letters. That capital S is not found in the Hebrew text. Hebrew does not have capital letters. So this is an area where Christians have to scratch their head and decide how to translate. But it does have the definite article. It doesn't say a Spirit entered into me. It says the Spirit entered into me. Okay. And set me on my feet. In this phrase here, I footnoted, I heard the one speaking to himself. That is a very difficult. Footnote 25, et medaber, is a very rare expression. It's a participial expression, and it means the one who speaks to himself. It sounds very Aristotelian to me that God from eternity talks to himself. The only other occurrence is in Numbers chapter 7, verse 89, a reference to Moses, regular hearing the divine voice from the Holy of Holies. Medieval commentator Rashi says the Shekinah, the glory, speaks in its majesty to itself, and its prophets or messengers overhear him. So he has the idea that the prophet is granted an audience with God's self-speaking, which is a very, very interesting idea. But this Hebrew word is very, very difficult to render. I like it. Yahweh calls Ezekiel by the title Son of Man, and I footnote that a little bit. Literally, though, the Hebrew text there says Son of Adam, because the Hebrew word for man is Adam. So if we were to render this colloquially, it would say, Son of Adam, stand on your feet. I didn't translate it that way because I felt like I was in Narnia there for a minute. Are you a son of Adam? Or a daughter of Eve? It's closely related to the Hebrew word Adamah, which means soil. So when you read the Genesis account, it says that the Adam is taken out of the Adamah. The closest we can come in English to that is to say that the earthling was taken out of the earth. I've tried that a few times, but it just sounds too sci-fi. As soon as you start talking about earthlings. Well, we don't have an English word for a human that is related. I suppose you can say that the human was taken out of the hummus. That doesn't sound good either. The human was taken out of the hummus. The earthling was taken out of the earth. So we got man and we got soil. And the poetic connection between them is, as they say, lost in translation. We just don't have a way to render it. And most translators who've tried to render it are going to end up with humans and hummus and earthlings and earth, and it's going to sound weird. But in Hebrew it works. No precise English equivalent. The important thing, though, probably here is that Ezekiel is singled out from all the divine things going on. He is just soil and dust. He's just surrounded by this vision. So, Son of Man is a way of putting him in his place, humbling him in the midst of these divine things. Ezekiel suggests that his ability to hear has resulted from his being infused with the Spirit. That also comes up in the book of Revelation. But what does the writer say? When I was in the Spirit. So that language taken up from the book of Ezekiel. And he's set on his feet. Ezekiel's calling is not an encouraging one. He is to inform the nation that they are faithless and tell them to return to the covenant. Son of man, I send you to the sons of Israel, to rebellious nations who have rebelled against me. They and their fathers have transgressed against me to this very day. Their sons are also brazen-faced. Brazen-faced means outwardly shameless. Brazen-faced kind of reminds me of the culture that I'm living in now with the young people. The young people, my parents and grandparents grew up in a generation where people, to my mind, sort of put on a show so that other people would think that they were better than they were. And that, nobody likes that, but the group that I feel that I'm growing up with now, they don't put on a show. They say, I'm a very selfish person. As though that makes it all okay. It's like, well, that doesn't fix it. So, brazen-faced means that you just shamelessly, you just have no shame. Like, I'm a very selfish person. I do what's right for me. And we're supposed to applaud them for their honesty on the one hand. But it's like, I don't see that as much of an improvement, in terms of the social mores of the time. So brazen-faced, just no shame whatsoever. Tough-hearted, so inwardly shameless. They don't know how to experience guilt. Lost the ability to feel bad. So not only are they socially and publicly, this is who I am, but inwardly, and I suppose we all experience that in some degree in the school of hard knocks. With young kids, when they really feel guilt, if you've raised kids, maybe you recall, they can't even breathe. They're so overwhelmed with guilt. And then, as we get older, what happens? The heart becomes hard, It's not like, when you see little kids, they can hardly catch their breath sometimes. They're so guilty. Anybody know what I'm talking about? Where they just, the heaving, the heaving of guilt. And then you reach a place where you just don't care anymore. And so that's the hardness of the heart. So Yahweh is telling Ezekiel, these are the people that I'm sending you to. So good luck. And you're going to say to them, this is a very important phrase, thus says Lord Yahweh. Now Ezekiel has his own name for God that doesn't occur much else in the old. We're used to hearing Yahweh Elohim, Yahweh God. Ezekiel likes this phrase, Adonai Yahweh. Lord Yahweh. In most translations I've found don't follow the Hebrew text here. I haven't figured out why. But this is Ezekiel's own signature. And there's a dynamic between Ezekiel. Some things he says publicly, some things he doesn't say to anybody. He only says publicly when the oracle says, thus says Adonai Yahweh. Then he's allowed to talk in public. And as we'll see when we go throughout the book, only some oracles have that. And so what we need to understand as readers is only the oracles that say, thus says Adonai Yahweh, does Ezekiel present to the public. A whole chunk of the book is entirely private. He's the only one who hears it. And not only does he not present it to the public, he's not allowed to present it to the public. So he has to live a double life. And most of the oracles that are happy and hopeful, he's not allowed to share. He has to keep them to himself. They might encourage him personally, but as we go through some of these early oracles, if you pay close attention to the text, thus says Adonai Yahweh, bad stuff. And then Yahweh speaks to him and will tell him other things, but at least for 7 years, this is the key, for 7 years they're private. What happens at the end of 7 years? Is Jerusalem will fall. And at that point, Ezekiel will go public. There's been a lot of discussion about that. Why is that? For 7 years at least, it's all gloom and doom and judgment, partially because nobody will believe him. Nobody's going to believe that his predictions will ever come to pass. Then when they do come to pass, well, now he has a foot in the door and he gets to actually say some other things. And maybe we can think of a situation where this obtains in real life. Okay, let's say you're raising a couple kids. And you say, you know, the way you're driving, I see some problems. Oh, yeah, what do you know? Blah, 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 blah. So you remind him, and then after a while you stop. Because they're not going to listen. What do you wait for? The day of the wreck. And then what do you say? I told you so? Oh, no, that's probably not the best way to put it. But anybody know a situation in life where you've told someone something over and over and over again and they haven't listened, and so you've said to yourself in your head, I'm going to have to wait till this thing blows up. And then when it blows up, I'll come on real gentle and I'll say, ahem. So that's the sort of thing that we're talking about. Ezekiel has a message, but he has to wait until Jerusalem and the temple falls before he can say anything else. That sort of a thing. Top of page 20. Let me see if there's any questions at this point, because we'll end 20 to 21, this particular lesson. One of the things I've tried to do, though, with the Hebrew text is show the Hebrew text is dropping clues about what Ezekiel is saying in public, what he's saying in private. I think a lot of times when we read these books of the prophets, we assume that they told everybody everything that's in the book. Not the case. Not the case at all. That was true in Jeremiah. Several of Jeremiah's prophecies are intended for just him personally. He's the only one that hears them. And you get the same idea with the Apostle Paul in the New Testament. There were certain things that were for Paul, and nobody else really heard them. So very, very interesting. Now, what that might mean for the prophet is it might fortify the prophet. Sometimes you get the idea that the prophet is one person standing against a world of opposition. What can fortify a person for that? Right? Most of us don't have that kind of metal. You know, I've got a lot. I'd say as human beings go, Chad Lewis has a lot of, I'm right and I don't care what anybody else says. But I'm not impervious. At a certain point, you do begin to wonder, am I crazy? You know, am I the only one who sees this? So the prophets have to be fortified. They have to be fortified because Yahweh's telling them, you are going to stand utterly alone. And everybody's going to oppose you. And so it's like, well, what can strengthen them for that ordeal? So I do think that the private and the public is important. Top of page 20. We have this, they will know that a prophet has been among them. That's important. In other words, when Jerusalem and the temple fall, it'll suddenly dawn on them that, oh, I guess Ezekiel was right. Now that's important because Ezekiel's writings have been preserved. They're in our Old Testament. Lots of prophets wrote and said all kinds of things. Hundreds of them. So we have to ask ourselves, why is this one in the Bible? Well, the only answer, at least one of the answers, is, well, after everything blew up and fell apart, they realized that he had been right. And so this phrase, they will know that a prophet has been among them, is an important phrase. You, son of man, be not afraid of them. Don't be afraid of their words. Though briars and thorns are with you, and you sit on scorpions. That's not a pleasant image. Be not afraid of their words, nor be dismayed at their looks, for they are a rebellious house. You shall speak my words to them, whether they hear or refuse to hear, for they are a rebellious house. Now, we know that an old tradition in Israel is that once a prophet is given a calling, his first task is to say, I'm not fit, and to try to wiggle out of it. And that began with the first prophet of ancient Israel, which is Moses. Moses set the bar. Go tell Pharaoh X, and Moses says, thanks. How about no? How about no? Who says that? Is that Austin Powers? Oh, that's it. How about no? I'm trying to pull on my very old pop culture references. At this stage, whenever I make a pop culture reference, it's at least 10 years old, which in the lifetime of the young people that I teach seems like a long time. Oh, very good. Now, Yahweh anticipates Ezekiel's objection, and we have this is the first time it happens in the Bible, but it's going to continue. He gives him a scroll to eat. Okay. Now, I was growing up, we used to have those things called testaments. You ever you would eat them. They still have them, all right. It was not a testament. The prophet's obedience is tested on the front end. Eat whatever I give you. That's an important phrase. Sort of like when somebody comes up to you and says, could you do something for me? And you don't immediately say yes. You say, what? So eat what I give you is a way of saying, do you trust me? I'm going to give you something. And the scroll gives concrete expression to the idea that God puts his words into the prophet's mouth. There's a literal ingesting of the word. Ezekiel's inner parts are to be suffused with God's word. They are to become one with him. They say you are what you eat. God's word is to become one with Ezekiel's own body, in fact. You, son of man, hear what I say to you. Be not rebellious like that rebellious house. Open your mouth and eat what I give you. When I looked, behold, a hand was stretched out to me, and behold, a scroll of a book was on it. He spread it before me. It had writing on the front and on the back, very typical for scrolls of the day. And there were written on it words of lamentation and mourning and woe. So no good news. We note that. There's no good news in the scroll that Ezekiel eats. He said to me, son of man, eat whatever you find here. Eat this scroll and go and speak to the house of Israel. So I opened my mouth. He gave me the scroll to eat, and he said to me, son of man, feed your belly with this scroll that I give you, and fill your stomach with it. And I ate it, and this is always an odd verse, in my mouth it was sweet as honey. What does that mean? There's a dispute about that. I don't know that there's like one Bible answer that everybody says. It was sweet as honey. Anyone want to write a commentary on this verse? What do you think, Pastor Chair? What do you think?
Immediately I'm getting the idea that it's sweet as honey, so he wants more.
Okay. So maybe a hunger for more is engendered. That's not a bad idea. Some people will say that the prophet is finds his preaching, even though his words are of bitterness and woe and lament, he finds his task sweet in the sense that he's speaking God's word. Anyways, a lot of dispute about that, but that's an interesting idea, and that reappears in the book of Revelation too, eating of the scroll and the sweetness of the scroll. Ezekiel is sent out. He is warned that the people will not listen to him. Much of what he does is going to look like a failure, but Yahweh is in it for the long game, and Ezekiel needs to be too. That's an important idea. We want to see results of what we do. We do. Everybody does. But sometimes, when we're dealing with God, he's in it for the long game. So it may not come to fruition in our lifetime. So he said to me, Son of man, go to the house of Israel and speak with my words to them. You are not sent to a people of foreign speech and a hard language, but to the house of Israel. Not to many peoples of foreign speech and hard language with words you cannot understand. Surely if I send you to such, they would listen to you. Okay, that's sarcasm. God is saying, well, if I sent you to the pagans, they'd probably listen to you. But that'd be like me as a pastor, if I sent you to non-churched people, they'd probably listen to you. But, the church people, they're not going to listen to you. Now, that's not you. New Temple's different. But the point is, everybody get the idea that sometimes dealing with non-religious people can in some ways be more beneficial than dealing with ostensibly religious people. We've all had that experience, I think. That, sometimes the religious crowd has all of these ideas in their head, and it's like, hitting a wall. Whereas you might actually have a profound, moving conversation with a non-religious person. So maybe that's a way of getting hold of what's going on in this passage. But the house of Israel will not be willing to listen to you, for they are not willing to listen to me. Because all the house of Israel have a hard forehead and a stubborn heart. Behold, I have made your face as hard as their faces, your forehead as hard as their foreheads. So you're going to butt heads, but Yahweh's going to make your head sufficient to the task. Like emery, harder than flint, I have made your forehead. Fear them not, nor be dismayed at their looks, for they are a rebellious house. Moreover, he said to me, Son of man, all my words that I shall speak to you, receive in your heart, hear with your ears. Go to the exiles, to your people, and speak to them and say to them, Thus says, here's Ezekiel's special word for God, Adonai Yahweh, whether they hear or refuse to hear. Now we transition. Ezekiel's going to move from this visionary experience and calling to ordinary life. That's a huge shift. The cartoon Prince of Egypt has this wonderful scene where Moses is at the burning bush and he's in this sort of ecstasy with Yahweh. And then within the space of a few seconds, he's back in the desert. So there's this abrupt shift. Ezekiel, as he walks from the canal to the exiles living at Tel Aviv, this is what he writes. A wind lifted me. I heard behind me a great rumbling noise. Blessed be the glory of Yahweh from its place, the noise of creatures' wings beating against one another, the noise of wheels alongside them in a great rumbling noise. The ecstasy of Ezekiel's religious experience, the jolt, suddenly finding himself in a familiar but depressing surroundings, puts him in a stupor of silence that lasts for a week. The wind lifted me and took me, and I went in bitterness of heart of my spirit, the hand of Yahweh being strong upon me. I came to the exiles, there's a typo, at Tel Aviv, who were dwelling by the Kebar Canal, and I sat where they were dwelling, and I sat there overwhelmed among them 7 days. Okay, so he's received his vision, he's received his calling, and he's wiped out for 7 days. Let me see if there's any thoughts or comments, because when we pick up next week, we'll be in the new lesson. And Yahweh's going to try to encourage him with something a little more constructive than his initial vision gave him. The initial vision and calling is like, yeah, I'm sending you out on a hopeless mission that nobody's going to listen to you. When we get to the next chapter, it does appear that some people will listen to him. So that at least gives Ezekiel a reason to persist. I'll see if there's any questions or comments. If not, I want to discuss one of the footnotes here as kind of an example of something that sometimes goes on in the Bible. But I'll give you all about 30 seconds to see if something pops into your head. Since I'm going to end on time today. This verse, chapter 3, verse 12. A wind lifted me, and I heard behind me a great rumbling noise. Blessed be the glory of Yahweh from its place. That is a strange verse. I footnoted it where it says a strange doxology, page 20. It says that the wings of the creatures produced a sound like a rumbling noise that becomes a doxology to the glory of Yahweh. However, this is something that sometimes happens in the biblical text. Our Hebrew text here has the word Baruch, and it may be a corruption of the word Barum. If I write Baruch in Hebrew, and I write Barum, let's see. These are very, very close, visually. Sometimes a kappa will actually come up a little bit. A kappa, I'm talking like it's Greek. I'm getting my Greek and my Hebrew. Kaf. Okay, so if you look at this, and you look at that, boy, those are pretty dang close. So sometimes what happens in a handwritten text, manuscript, is you may have a letter that looks very close to another letter. Another couple letters that often get jumbled are Dalet and Resh. Very, very close. And so one thing that, as Hebrew scholars are working with the text, if they run into a sentence that doesn't quite make sense, the way that it's written, they'll hypothesize a corruption. Corruption doesn't mean like bad, like evil corruption, but two letters that look very similar. So here, the phrase, blessed be the glory of Yahweh from its place, if we shift those letters, we can get the sentence, when the glory of Yahweh rose from its place. So this verse could read, a wind lifted me, and I heard behind me a great rumbling noise, when the glory of Yahweh rose from its place. Now that makes a lot of sense. Or I heard behind me a great rumbling noise, blessed be the glory of Yahweh from its place. So there's an example of, sometimes people ask, why certain translations are different, or why there's disagreements about people how to translate things. Sometimes in these ancient texts, it can just be a single letter. In a single letter, we'll give you a text that says one thing, and a single letter will give you a text that says another thing. So I footnoted that because I thought it was interesting. Most translations are going to go with, blessed be the glory of Yahweh from its place, because that is the traditional rendering. And the traditional rendering always wins. However, I don't know. The one I have in the footnote is compelling, Does it matter? That's the other question. But when I go into the text, these little rabbit trails interest me. They do interest me. So I don't know what you can do with footnote 27. That's for your, how do I put it? Curiosity. Sheer, unadulterated curiosity. I got to let you go, though, because we're out of time. So thank you. We'll start on the next lesson next week. Thank you very much.